Good evening, and welcome to what might be the most uncomfortable question you'll face today. Would you survive a Stone Age winter? Not the romanticized version where cavemen grunt charmingly around cozy fires, but the real deal, where your ancestors spent months playing a deadly game of freeze tag with hypothermia, starvation, and very large, very hungry predators. Tonight, we're diving headfirst into the brutal mathematics of survival during humanity's harshest season, when your morning routine wasn't checking your phone, but rather checking if you still had all your toes. Before we start gathering firewood and hunting mammoths, pause that comfortable life of yours for just a moment. Leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is right now. Are you safely cocooned in your centrally heated home, perhaps wrapped in a blanket that costs more than a Stone Age family's entire winter food supply? Or are you boldly watching this late at night, unknowingly mimicking your ancestors who spent their evenings huddled in caves, listening for the sound of approaching death? And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button, because learning from history's most desperate survival stories might just be the difference between thriving in the modern world and ending up as a cautionary tale yourself. After all, the only thing worse than freezing to death would be freezing to death while remaining ignorant of just how spectacularly unprepared you really are. Now, let's set the scene properly. Picture this. It's roughly 15,000 years ago, give or take a few millennia. Because when you're living hand to mouth, precise calendar keeping isn't exactly a priority. The last ice age is winding down, but winding down in geological terms means it's still cold enough to freeze your breath mid-sentence and turn your morning constitutional into a life-threatening expedition. You wake up not to an alarm clock, but to the delightful sensation of frost forming on your eyelashes. Your weather app is the ache in your bones, and today's forecast calls for a 100% chance of survive or die trying. The modern human brain, cushioned by grocery stores, Netflix, and the general assumption that someone else will handle the hard stuff, simply cannot fathom the relentless brutality of a Stone Age winter. We complain when our coffee takes too long or our Wi-Fi stutters during a video call. Meanwhile, your Stone Age counterpart is calculating whether that suspicious rustling in the bushes is dinner approaching or if dinner is about to be served, and they're the main course. Let's start with the most fundamental question. What exactly made Stone Age winters so spectacularly deadly? First, there was the cold itself, and we're not talking about the kind of cold that makes you reach for a sweater. We're talking about temperatures that would make a modern freezer seem tropical. The kind of cold that turns human flesh into a brittle, breakable substance and makes every breath feel like swallowing shards of ice. The average winter temperature during the late Pleistocene could drop to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's on a good day. On a bad day, well, let's just say that complaining about the weather wasn't really an option because your tongue would freeze to the roof of your mouth mid-complaint. But temperature was just the opening act in this symphony of survival horror. The real headliner was the food situation, or more accurately, the complete and utter lack thereof. During summer and autumn, Stone Age humans could rely on a relatively diverse menu: berries, nuts, roots, the occasional mammoth if they were feeling particularly ambitious and suicidal. But winter transformed the landscape into a barren wasteland, where even the most optimistic forager would struggle to find enough calories to keep a hamster alive, let alone a full-grown human with the metabolic demands of a creature that had recently discovered fire and was very proud of it. The mathematics of Stone Age survival are grimly simple. An adult human needs, roughly, 2,000 to 3,000 calories per day to maintain basic bodily functions. In winter, when you're constantly shivering, building fires, and engaging in the high-energy activity of not dying, that number can easily double. Meanwhile, the available food sources drop to nearly zero. It's like trying to run a car on fumes while driving uphill through a blizzard, except the car is your body, The hill is survival itself, and the blizzard is everything else in the world trying to kill you. So how did Stone Age humans prepare for this annual dance with death? The answer is both ingenious and terrifying, depending on your perspective. Preparation began months before the first frost. During the abundant summer months, when food was plentiful and death seemed like a distant, abstract concept. Think of it as the world's most primitive version of meal prep. Except instead of Instagram-worthy containers filled with quinoa salad, you're looking at strips of mammoth meat hanging from cave ceilings like some kind of prehistoric delicatessen from hell. The process of preparing meat for winter storage was an art form that would make modern food. Scientists weep with admiration, and modern food safety inspectors weep with horror. Fresh meat, assuming you were lucky enough to bring down something large and protein-rich, had to be processed immediately. There were no refrigerators, no vacuum sealers, no preservatives beyond salt. If you were fortunate enough to live near a salt deposit, instead, Stone Age humans relied on a combination of smoking, drying, and the time-honored tradition of hoping that the meat would dry before it rotted and killed everyone who ate it. Picture the scene: a successful mammoth hunt, which was roughly as likely as winning the lottery while being struck by lightning during a solar eclipse. But significantly more dangerous, the entire community would mobilize to process thousands of pounds of meat before spoilage turned their windfall into a death sentence. Every scrap of flesh would be carved away from the bones, cut into thin strips, and hung over smoking fires that had to be maintained constantly. The process took days, during which the community couldn't afford to let their guard down for a moment. Predators could smell the meat from miles away, and nothing says dinner invitation quite like a cave full of smoking mammoth jerky. But let's be honest about the success rate of these hunting expeditions. For every triumphant mammoth takedown that provided months of sustenance, there were dozens of failed hunts that left the community hungrier and more desperate. Hunting megafauna with primitive weapons was less a reliable food acquisition strategy and more an elaborate form of prehistoric Russian roulette. The mammoth had several advantages: size, strength, thick hide, and a general disinclination to become dinner. The humans had opposable thumbs and an unreasonable amount of optimism. The weapons available to Stone Age hunters were marvels of primitive engineering and testaments to human determination in the face of overwhelming odds. Spears tipped with carefully knapped stone points, crafted with the kind of precision that modern manufacturers would struggle to match. Otlots, or spear throwers, that could multiply the force and accuracy of a thrown spear. Bolas, weighted, throwing weapons designed to tangle the legs of running prey. These were sophisticated tools, absolutely. But they were sophisticated tools designed to take down creatures that could crush a human being like a grape under an elephant's foot. The hunting strategies employed by Stone-Aged humans were a fascinating blend of intelligence, desperation, and barely controlled insanity. They would spend days tracking herds, learning movement patterns, identifying the weak and the young. They would coordinate group hunts that required split-second timing and absolute trust in their companions. They would drive entire herds toward cliffs or into carefully constructed traps, using fire and noise to create stampedes that were as likely to trample the hunters as they were to provide dinner. And when the big game proved elusive, which was most of the time, Stone Age humans turned to smaller prey with the same deadly seriousness. Rabbits, birds, fish when available, anything that moved and contained protein. They became master trappers, creating snares and deadfalls that could operate independently while the humans focused on other survival tasks. These traps were marvels of primitive engineering, designed to kill quickly and efficiently while minimizing the risk to the humans who set them. But hunting was only half the equation. The other half was gathering. and winter gathering was an exercise in finding sustenance in a landscape that seemed designed to offer nothing but death and disappointment. Nuts could be stored if they were properly dried and protected from rodents. Roots could be cached in underground storage pits, assuming you could remember where you buried them, and assuming they hadn't frozen into inedible blocks of plant matter. Berries could be dried into leather-like strips that retained some nutritional value and most of their ability to keep you alive for another day. The knowledge required for successful gathering was encyclopedic and absolutely critical. A Stone Age human had to know not just what was edible, but when it was edible, how to process it for maximum nutritional value, and how to store it for months without spoilage. They had to distinguish between plants that would sustain life and plants that would end it in spectacular and unpleasant ways. They had to understand seasonal patterns, weather cycles, and the complex relationships between different species that could signal abundance or scarcity. This brings us to one of the most overlooked aspects of Stone Age winter survival: the sheer amount of knowledge required to stay alive. Modern humans have the luxury of specialization. We can focus on narrow fields of expertise because we can rely on others to handle the rest. A Stone Age human had to be simultaneously a hunter, gatherer, toolmaker, weather predictor, animal behaviorist, botanist, physician, and tactical strategist. They had to master skills that would challenge modern experts while doing so with none of the tools, resources, or safety nets that we take for granted. The social dynamics of Stone Age survival were equally complex and critical. Individual survival was virtually impossible. Humans had survived and thrived as a species specifically because they had learned to cooperate in groups. But group living during a resource-scarce winter brought its own challenges. Resources had to be shared fairly enough to maintain group cohesion. But fairly doesn't always mean equally when some group members contribute more to survival than others. Leadership during crisis was a matter of life and death, not just for the leader, but for everyone who depended on their decisions. The wrong call about when to move camp, where to hunt, or how to ration food could doom the entire group. Leaders had to balance competing interests, manage personalities, and make decisions with incomplete information, while under the kind of pressure that would cause modern executives to curl up in a corner and weep for their mothers. The psychological toll of Stone Age winter survival is something that modern humans can barely comprehend. We live with the assumption that tomorrow will be roughly similar to today, that our basic needs will be met, that help is available if things go wrong. Stone Age humans lived with the constant knowledge that they were always one bad decision, one stroke of bad luck, one harsh storm away from death. Not metaphorical death, not career death, not social death, but actual, literal, permanent death. Imagine waking up every morning and having your first conscious thought be a calculation of your odds of surviving until sunset. Imagine going to sleep every night wondering if you'll wake up, if the fire will last, if predators will find your shelter, if the food will hold out until spring. Imagine living with the knowledge that winter is coming, as inevitable as sunrise, and that it might be the winter that finally claims you. The stress of constant survival pressure would have profound effects on both individuals and communities. Chronic stress suppresses immune function, making people more susceptible to disease at exactly the time when medical care consisted of hoping really hard that the problem would go away on its own. Malnutrition compounds these effects, creating a downward spiral where the body becomes less capable of fighting off threats just as threats become more numerous and dangerous. Yet somehow, incredibly, impossibly, Stone Age humans not only survived these brutal winters, but managed to thrive well enough to continue the species. They developed technologies, art, culture, and social structures that would form the foundation of all subsequent human civilization. They didn't just endure, They found ways to make meaning and beauty and joy even in the midst of conditions that would break most modern humans within days. This brings us to the question of fire, perhaps the single most important technology in human history and absolutely critical for winter survival. Fire provided heat, obviously, but it also provided light, protection from predators, a means of cooking food to make it safer and more digestible, and a psychological anchor in the darkness and cold. Managing fire during a Stone Age winter was a full-time job that literally meant the difference between life and death. Creating fire from scratch with primitive tools is difficult under the best of circumstances. Creating fire when your hands are numb with cold, when tinder is wet or frozen, when wind threatens to blow out your efforts before they can catch, is exponentially harder. Stone Age humans had to become absolute masters of fire creation, capable of producing flame quickly and reliably even under the worst possible conditions. But creating fire was only the beginning. Maintaining fire required a constant supply of fuel, and fuel became increasingly scarce as winter progressed. Dead wood, the easiest fuel source, would be consumed first. Green wood could be burned, but it produced more smoke than heat and required more energy to burn than it provided in warmth. Eventually, Stone Age humans would be burning anything that would combust. Dried dung, animal fat, even leather and clothing if the alternative was freezing to death. The logistics of fire management during winter were staggering. Fires had to be maintained continuously, which meant someone had to be awake and tending them at all times. Fuel had to be gathered, stored, and rationed. Multiple fires might be necessary, one for heat, one for cooking, one for protection. Each fire required its own supply of fuel, its own maintenance, its own vigilant guardian. And then there was the smoke. Fire produces smoke, and smoke has to go somewhere. In open-air fires, smoke disperses naturally. But when you're trying to heat an enclosed space, smoke management becomes a matter of life and death. Too much ventilation, and you lose all your heat. Too little ventilation, and you suffocate on smoke and carbon monoxide. Stone Age humans had to become masters of airflow dynamics, understanding how to balance heat retention with smoke dispersal using nothing but intuition and hard-won experience. The shelters themselves were marvels of primitive engineering designed around the fundamental challenge of staying warm without dying of smoke inhalation. Cave dwellings, when available, provided natural windbreaks and thermal mass. But they also created problems with air circulation and smoke management. Constructed shelters, built from whatever materials were available, had to balance structural integrity with thermal efficiency, while being portable enough to abandon quickly if circumstances required. The most sophisticated Stone Age winter shelters were probably the mammoth bone houses found in archaeological sites across Eastern Europe. These structures, built from the bones of mammoths and other large animals, represent the pinnacle of Stone Age architecture. They were semi-permanent structures designed specifically for winter survival, with careful attention paid to insulation, ventilation, and defensibility. But most Stone Age humans didn't have access to mammoth bones or the resources to construct elaborate winter dwellings. They made do with whatever was available: animal hides stretched over wooden frames, earth lodges dug into hillsides, lean-tos constructed from branches and bark. These shelters were often barely adequate for survival, providing just enough protection from wind and precipitation to keep their occupants alive until spring. The clothing worn by Stone Age humans during winter was their first and most important line of defense against the cold. Modern synthetic fabrics and advanced insulation are marvels of technology, but they pale in comparison to the ingenuity and effectiveness of well-made Stone Age winter clothing. Animal hides, properly prepared and tailored, could provide insulation that rivaled modern gear while being completely renewable and repairable in the field. The process of creating winter clothing began with hunting and trapping, of course, but it didn't end there. Hides had to be properly cleaned, treated, and preserved to prevent rot and maintain flexibility. This involves scraping away all flesh and fat, treating with brain-tanning agents or other natural chemicals, and working the hide until it reached the proper texture and pliability. The entire process took days of intensive labor and required considerable skill and experience. Tailoring Stone Age clothing required an understanding of both human anatomy and thermal dynamics. Loose-fitting garments allowed for air circulation and layering but provided less wind protection. Tight-fitting garments offered better wind resistance, but could restrict circulation and cause overheating during physical activity. The best Stone Age tailors understood how to balance these competing requirements, creating garments that could adapt to changing conditions and activity levels. But even the best clothing was only as good as its maintenance, and maintaining leather clothing in winter conditions was an ongoing challenge. Wet leather could freeze solid, becoming brittle and prone to cracking. Dry leather could become stiff and uncomfortable. Leather exposed to smoke and fire could shrink or become damaged. Stone Age humans had to constantly monitor and care for their clothing, making repairs and adjustments as needed to maintain its protective qualities. The footwear worn by Stone Age humans deserves special attention because feet are particularly vulnerable to cold injury. Frostbite in the extremities could lead to infection, gangrene, and death, making proper foot protection absolutely critical. Stone Age footwear had to protect against cold, moisture, and rough terrain while remaining flexible enough to allow normal walking and running. The most effective Stone Age footwear was probably multi-layered, combining animal hide outer shells with insulating materials like fur or dried grass. The best designs allowed for the replacement of insulating materials as they became wet or worn, extending the useful life of the footwear and maintaining protection in harsh conditions. But let's talk about what happened when all these preparations failed. When the hunting was unsuccessful, when the food stores ran out, when winter proved longer or harsher than expected. Because failure was always a possibility, and Stone Age humans had to be prepared to survive even when their primary survival strategies fell short. Starvation was a constant threat during Stone Age winters, and the human body's response to prolonged starvation is both fascinating and horrifying. The body begins by burning fat reserves, which provides energy but also depletes insulation just when it's most needed. As fat reserves are exhausted, the body begins breaking down muscle tissue, which reduces strength and endurance at precisely the time when physical capability is most critical for survival. The psychological effects of starvation compound the physical ones. Hunger affects judgment, decision-making, and emotional regulation. Starving people become irritable, paranoid, and prone to poor decisions that can endanger themselves and their companions. Group cohesion, so critical for survival, begins to break down as individuals become focused on their own immediate needs rather than the welfare of the community. But humans are remarkably adaptable, and Stone Age people developed strategies for surviving even extreme food shortages. They learned to identify and exploit marginal food sources that would normally be ignored. Inner bark from certain trees, roots that required extensive processing to become edible, insects and larvae that could be found even in winter conditions. They also developed sophisticated food rationing strategies, carefully calculating how to distribute limited resources to maximize the chances of group survival. This might mean providing more food to the hunters and gatherers who were most likely to find additional resources, even if it meant others went hungrier. It might mean making hard decisions about who was most likely to survive and focusing limited resources on those individuals. The social dynamics of starvation were particularly challenging. Sharing food equally might seem fair, but it could result in everyone dying slowly rather than some surviving to continue the group. But unequal distribution could destroy group cohesion and lead to conflict that was even more dangerous than starvation. Leaders had to navigate these impossible choices while maintaining the trust and cooperation necessary for group survival. When hunting large game became impossible due to scarcity or weather conditions, Stone-aged humans turned to increasingly desperate measures. They learned to track and hunt in conditions that would challenge modern survival experts. They developed techniques for hunting at night, in storms, in terrain that seemed impossible to navigate. They became masters of patience, spending days or weeks tracking prey that might provide only a single meal. They also became expert scavengers, learning to follow predators and claim portions of their kills. This was dangerous work, requiring the ability to drive away or intimidate animals that were larger, stronger, and better armed than humans. But desperation makes people brave, and a starving human will take risks that would seem insane under normal circumstances. The processing and consumption of marginal food sources required considerable knowledge and skill. Many plant foods that could sustain life in emergencies required extensive preparation to be safely edible. Acorns, for example, contain bitter tannins that can be toxic in large quantities. But with proper leaching and preparation, they become a nutritious and life-saving food source. The knowledge of how to process these foods had to be preserved and transmitted across generations, often through oral traditions that were as important as any physical tool. Stone Age humans also had to deal with the presence of large predators that saw human settlements as potential feeding opportunities. Wolves, bears, large cats, and other carnivores were not just threats to livestock or food stores, but direct threats to human life. Winter made these threats even more dangerous, as hungry predators became bolder and more desperate, while humans became weaker and less capable of defense. Protecting against predators required constant vigilance and careful planning. Settlements had to be located to provide natural barriers against attack, while still allowing access to water and other resources. Fires had to be maintained not just for heat, but for the protection they provided against nocturnal hunters. Weapons had to be kept ready at all times, and everyone in the community had to understand their role in collective defense. The psychological impact of living under constant threat from predators cannot be overstated. Every sound in the night could signal approaching danger. Every venture outside the safety of the settlement carried the risk of encountering something that viewed humans as food. Sleep became a luxury that had to be carefully rationed, with individuals taking turns maintaining watch while others rested. But perhaps the most insidious threat faced by Stone-aged humans during winter was disease. The combination of cold, malnutrition, stress, and close quarters created ideal conditions for the spread of infectious diseases. Without modern medicine, antibiotics, or even basic sanitation, a simple respiratory infection could quickly become a death sentence. The close quarters required for winter survival meant that diseases spread rapidly through the entire community. One sick individual could infect everyone, turning a survivable winter into a community-wide catastrophe. Stone-aged humans had to develop strategies for isolating the sick, while still providing care and maintaining group cohesion. They also had to develop treatments using only natural materials and traditional knowledge. Some of these treatments were surprisingly effective, based on plants and procedures that modern medicine has validated. Others were probably useless or even harmful, but in the absence of alternatives, they provided psychological comfort and the hope that something could be done to fight back against disease. The knowledge of medicinal plants and healing techniques was typically held by specialized individuals within the community, often older members who had accumulated years of experience. These healers were invaluable during winter months, when injuries and illnesses became more common and more dangerous. but they were also vulnerable to the same threats as everyone else, and the loss of a skilled healer could doom an entire community. Injuries took on special significance during Stone Age winters because they could quickly become life-threatening in ways that would be merely inconvenient in modern times. A sprained ankle that might sideline a modern person for a few days could mean death for someone who depended on mobility for survival. A cut that would require a few stitches in a modern emergency room could become infected and lead to sepsis without proper medical care. Stone Age humans had to become expert at preventing injuries through careful planning and risk assessment. They had to understand their own physical limitations and the limitations of their tools and equipment. They had to develop techniques for performing dangerous tasks as safely as possible, while still accomplishing the work necessary for survival. When injuries did occur, treatment had to be immediate and effective, using only available resources. Stone Age humans developed sophisticated understanding of anatomy, wound care, and healing processes. They used plant-based medicines, animal products, and mechanical techniques that were remarkably advanced for their time and circumstances. The social care of injured community members presented another layer of complexity. An injured person might be unable to contribute to group survival, but still required food, warmth, and protection. Groups had to make difficult decisions about how much resources to invest in caring for individuals who might not recover enough to contribute to future survival efforts. Now, let's consider the psychological and social pressures that built up over the course of a long winter. Imagine being confined with the same group of people for months, under conditions of extreme stress, with limited resources and constant threats. Modern people struggle with cabin fever after a few days of bad weather. Stone Age humans had to maintain group cohesion and individual sanity through months of conditions that would challenge the most stable personalities. Conflict resolution became a critical survival skill because interpersonal disputes could destroy group cohesion at exactly the time when cooperation was most essential. Leaders had to mediate disputes, allocate resources fairly, and maintain morale while dealing with their own stress and fear. They had to balance individual needs against group welfare, making decisions that could literally determine who lived and who died. The entertainment and cultural activities that helped people cope with winter stress were not frivolous luxuries, but essential components of psychological survival. Storytelling, music, games, and artistic activities provided mental stimulation and emotional release during the long, dark months when physical activity was limited. These activities also served to transmit important cultural knowledge and maintain social bonds that were critical for group survival. Religious and spiritual practices probably played important roles in helping people cope with the psychological stress of winter survival. Rituals and ceremonies provided structure and meaning during chaotic and frightening times. They offered explanations for events that seemed random and uncontrollable, and they provided hope that survival and spring were possible. The seasonal cycle itself had profound psychological impacts on Stone Age communities. The gradual shortening of days leading up to winter solstice would have been deeply concerning to people who depended on daylight for most activities. The knowledge that days would eventually start getting longer again was crucial for maintaining hope and motivation during the darkest parts of winter. But let's return to the central question. Would you, as a modern human, survive a Stone Age winter? The honest answer for most of us is absolutely not. We have become so specialized and dependent on modern technology that we have lost most of the basic skills that were essential for Stone Age survival. Consider your current physical condition compared to that of a Stone Age human. They were lean, strong, and conditioned by a lifetime of physical activity. They had cardiovascular fitness that would challenge modern athletes, muscle strength developed through constant manual labor, and metabolic efficiency honed by cycles of feast and famine. Most modern humans, Even those who consider themselves physically fit would struggle to match the basic physical capabilities that were standard for Stone Age survival. Our knowledge base is similarly inadequate. We might know how to program computers, analyze financial markets, or perform complex medical procedures, but we probably don't know how to identify edible plants, track animals, or create fire without matches. We have traded depth of survival knowledge for breadth of specialized knowledge, a trade that serves us well in modern society, but would be fatal in Stone Age conditions. Our psychological preparedness is perhaps even more inadequate than our physical or intellectual preparedness. We are accustomed to comfort, predictability, and the assumption that someone else will handle life-threatening problems. The constant stress, uncertainty, and proximity to death that characterized Stone Age winters would probably break most modern people, psychologically long before the physical challenges became fatal. We have also lost the social skills and cultural frameworks that made group survival possible. Modern individualism, while valuable in many contexts, is poorly suited to the kind of collective action and resource sharing that was essential for Stone Age survival. We would probably struggle to subordinate individual desires to group needs, to accept leadership decisions we disagreed with, or to maintain cooperation under extreme stress. But there are some advantages that modern humans might bring to Stone Age survival situations. Our scientific understanding of nutrition, disease, and human physiology could potentially improve survival outcomes if we could apply this knowledge with available resources. Our understanding of physics and engineering might help us design better tools, shelters, or heating systems using Stone Age materials. Our literacy and numerical skills might help us better track resources, plan for future needs, and maintain more detailed knowledge of seasonal patterns and survival strategies. Our understanding of probability and risk assessment might help us make better decisions about when to take chances and when to play it safe. Most importantly, perhaps, our knowledge of what is possible might give us hope and motivation that could help us persist through difficulties that might seem insurmountable. Knowing that humans have survived ice ages before, that spring always comes eventually, that technological and social solutions exist for survival problems might provide the psychological strength needed to endure extreme hardship. The question of modern survival in Stone Age conditions is not just academic curiosity. Climate change, natural disasters, economic collapse, or other catastrophic events could potentially force modern humans to survive in conditions that more closely resemble those of our Stone Age ancestors. Understanding what such survival would require might help us prepare for unlikely but possible futures. More immediately, understanding Stone Age survival can give us perspective on our current lives and challenges, the problems that seem overwhelming in modern life, the stress that keeps us awake at night, the difficulties that make us question our ability to cope. These all pale in comparison to the daily life-or-death struggles that our ancestors faced and overcame. There is something both humbling and inspiring about contemplating Stone Age winter survival. Humbling because it reveals how soft and dependent we have become, how many basic survival skills we have lost, how unprepared we would be to face the challenges that our ancestors considered routine. Inspiring because it demonstrates the incredible resilience, ingenuity, and determination of the human species, the ability to not just survive, but to thrive under conditions that seem impossible. Our ancestors did not just endure these brutal winters. They used them as opportunities to develop technologies, social structures, and cultural practices that would eventually lead to all of human civilization. They created art in caves, developed complex tool-making techniques, formed social bonds that would last lifetimes, and passed down knowledge that would benefit generations yet unborn. The legacy of Stone Age winter survival is not just that our ancestors managed to stay alive long enough to reproduce. The legacy is that they developed the fundamental human characteristics that would make all subsequent progress possible: cooperation, innovation, persistence, and the ability to find meaning and beauty even in the midst of extreme hardship. So would you survive a Stone Age winter? Probably not, if we're being honest about it. But the more important question might be, what can you learn from the people who did survive? And how can that knowledge make you more resilient, more capable, and more appreciative of the incredible privileges and opportunities that modern life provides? The next time you complain about your heating bill, remember that your Stone Age ancestors would have considered central heating to be literally miraculous. The next time you stress about finding something good to watch on Netflix, remember that your ancestors had to provide their own entertainment while listening for the sounds of approaching predators. The next time you worry about your diet, remember that your ancestors measured nutritional success not in optimal macronutrient ratios, but in not dying of starvation. This is not to minimize the real challenges and stresses of modern life, but rather to provide some perspective on human resilience and adaptability. If our ancestors could survive conditions that would kill most of us within days, perhaps we can find the strength to handle whatever challenges our modern world presents. The story of Stone Age winter survival is ultimately a story about human ingenuity, determination, and the power of community cooperation in the face of overwhelming odds. It is a reminder that we are the descendants of people who refuse to give up, who found ways to survive and thrive in conditions that seemed impossible, who created the foundation for everything that came after. As we wrap up this exploration of Stone Age winter survival, take a moment to appreciate the warm shelter you're sitting in, the abundant food available to you, the medical care that keeps you healthy, and the social systems that protect you from most of life's major threats. These are not just modern conveniences. They are the culmination of thousands of generations of human innovation and cooperation, starting with the people who learned how to survive winter with nothing but stone tools, animal hides, and an unshakable determination to see another spring. And maybe, just maybe, if you ever find yourself facing your own survival challenges, you can draw inspiration from the knowledge that you carry the genetic and cultural legacy of the most successful survivors in the history of life on Earth. Your ancestors survived ice ages, famines, predators, diseases, and countless other threats that would seem insurmountable. Their strength, their ingenuity, and their refusal to give up are part of your heritage. Would you survive a Stone Age winter? Perhaps the more important question is whether you can learn to approach your modern challenges with the same determination, creativity, and community spirit that allowed your ancestors to turn seemingly impossible survival situations into the foundation for all of human civilization. The winter winds that once threatened to extinguish human existence now serve as reminders of how far we have come and how strong we can be when necessity demands it. Our ancestors faced the darkness and cold with nothing but primitive tools and unconquerable spirits. They not only survived, but laid the groundwork for a world where their descendants could contemplate their struggles from the comfort and safety of modern civilization. That is perhaps the greatest victory of all. Not just that they survived, but that they survived so well that we can now ask whether we could do the same. The very fact that you're watching this video, warm and safe and fed, is proof of their incredible success. You are their legacy, their gift to the future. The living demonstration that even the most impossible challenges can be overcome with enough determination, ingenuity, and hope. So the next time winter arrives, with its short days and cold winds, remember that you are the descendant of people who saw the same seasonal change and knew it meant months of life or death struggle. Remember that they faced those challenges with courage and creativity and community spirit. Remember that they did not just survive. They thrived well enough to create the world you now inhabit. And maybe, in your own small way, you can honor their memory by approaching your own challenges with the same unshakable determination that allowed them to turn Stone Age winters from seasons of death into seasons of human triumph. But let's dig deeper into the specific horrors that awaited anyone unfortunate enough to experience a Stone Age winter firsthand. We've covered the broad strokes, but the devil, as they say, is in the details, and in this case, the devil is wearing a parka made of mammoth hide and laughing maniacally at your soft, modern sensibilities. Consider the daily routine of a Stone Age human during winter. Your alarm clock is the gradual realization that you can no longer feel your toes, which may or may not still be attached to your feet. Your morning coffee is whatever liquid you can find that hasn't frozen solid overnight, assuming you can find any liquid at all. Your breakfast is whatever scraps remain from yesterday's meal, if there were any scraps. Which there probably weren't, because waste was a luxury your ancestors couldn't afford. The bathroom situation alone would send most modern humans into psychological collapse. There were no heated indoor facilities, no toilet paper, no privacy, and certainly no reading material to pass the time during your morning constitutional. Instead, you would venture outside into temperatures that could freeze saliva mid-spit. Find a location that was both defensible against predators and downwind from your shelter, and conduct your business with the speed and efficiency of someone who understood that lingering could result in frostbitten body parts that you'd rather keep functional. Personal hygiene, that cornerstone of modern civilization, was essentially a summer luxury during Stone Age winters. Bathing in near-freezing water was not just uncomfortable, but potentially fatal, as wet skin lost heat 25 times faster than dry skin. Your ancestors learned to live with levels of personal uncleanliness that would violate multiple modern health codes, and probably qualify as biological warfare by contemporary standards. But the smell was the least of their problems. Poor hygiene contributed to skin infections, parasites, and diseases that could quickly become life-threatening without modern medical intervention. Lice, fleas, and other parasites thrived in the unwashed conditions, creating constant discomfort and serving as vectors for more serious diseases. Your ancestors learned to accept itching, scratching, and general bodily discomfort as normal parts of existence, because the alternative was risking death by exposure during unnecessary cleaning activities. The psychological impact of living in such conditions cannot be overstated. Modern humans experience stress and anxiety when our Wi-Fi is slow or our coffee is lukewarm. Imagine the mental toll of waking up every morning wondering if today would be the day you finally succumb to starvation, exposure, disease, or predation. Imagine going to sleep every night with the knowledge that you might not wake up, and that if you did wake up, tomorrow would bring the same life-threatening challenges as today. The constant proximity to death created a mindset that modern humans can barely comprehend. Death was not an abstract concept to be contemplated philosophically. It was a daily companion, a persistent threat that influenced every decision and action. This proximity to mortality probably contributed to the development of spiritual and religious beliefs that helped people cope with the randomness and brutality of their existence. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the complete absence of rescue or backup plans. When things went wrong for Stone Age humans, there were no emergency services to call, no hospitals to visit, no social safety nets to fall back on. If you broke a leg, you either healed or died. If you got lost, you either found your way back or perished in the wilderness. If your food ran out, you either found more or starved. The finality of failure was absolute and unforgiving. This brings us to one of the most harrowing aspects of Stone Age winter survival, the mathematics of group dynamics during resource scarcity. When food becomes critically short, communities face impossible decisions about resource allocation. Do you feed the children first, ensuring the future of the group but potentially losing the adults who could find more food? Do you prioritize the hunters and gatherers who are most likely to secure additional resources? Do you attempt to keep everyone alive equally, knowing that this strategy might result in everyone dying slowly rather than some surviving? These decisions were not theoretical exercises in ethics. They were immediate, practical problems that required quick resolution. Leaders had to make choices that would determine who lived and who died, often with incomplete information and under extreme time pressure. The psychological burden of such responsibility would crush most modern leaders, who struggle with far less consequential decisions in climate-controlled boardrooms with abundant resources and expert advisors. The social dynamics that emerged from these survival pressures were simultaneously beautiful and terrible. Communities developed bonds of mutual dependence that were stronger than anything most modern humans experience. They learned to trust each other with their lives, to sacrifice individual comfort for group survival, and to find meaning and purpose in collective struggle against overwhelming odds. But these same pressures also created potential for conflict that could destroy groups from within. Competition for limited resources, disagreements about survival strategies, personality conflicts exacerbated by stress and confinement. All of these could fracture the cooperation that was essential for group survival. Leaders had to manage these tensions while dealing with their own fear, hunger, and exhaustion. The children in Stone Age communities faced particularly harsh realities during winter months. Modern children are protected from most of life's dangers and hardships, allowed to focus on play, learning, and development in safe, controlled environments. Stone Age children were expected to contribute to survival efforts as soon as they were physically capable, understanding that their own lives and the lives of their family members depended on everyone doing their part. Child mortality rates during Stone Age winters were staggeringly high by modern standards. Children were more vulnerable to cold, disease, and malnutrition than adults, and their smaller bodies had less thermal mass and fewer energy reserves to sustain them through periods of scarcity. Parents had to make heartbreaking decisions about resource allocation, sometimes choosing to focus their limited resources on children, who were more likely to survive, rather than attempting to save those who were weakest. The educational system for Stone Age children was brutally practical and absolutely critical. Children had to learn skills that would keep them alive, and they had to learn them quickly and thoroughly. A mistake in plant identification could result in poisoning. A careless noise while hunting could scare away food or attract predators. A poorly maintained fire could mean death by exposure for the entire group. But children were also the repository of hope for Stone Age communities. They represented the future, the justification for all the struggle and sacrifice required for winter survival. Adults would endure incredible hardships, partly for the chance that their children might survive to see spring, grow to adulthood, and continue the community into the future. The elderly faced their own unique challenges during Stone Age winters. In modern society, age brings retirement, medical care, and social support systems designed to ensure dignity and comfort in later years. In Stone Age society, aging meant becoming increasingly vulnerable to the very threats that younger adults could barely manage. Elderly individuals who could no longer contribute significantly to hunting, gathering, or other survival tasks represented both a burden and a treasure for their communities. They consumed resources while producing less, but they also possessed accumulated knowledge and wisdom that could mean the difference between community survival and extinction. They knew the locations of emergency food sources, the patterns of weather and animal behavior, the techniques for surviving the worst conditions. The treatment of elderly community members during resource-scarce periods reveals something profound about Stone Age values and social organization. Many communities developed systems for caring for elders even when resources were critically short, suggesting that they valued knowledge and experience highly enough to invest precious resources in maintaining access to it. But the reality was that elderly individuals who became completely dependent on others for survival faced grim prospects during the harshest winters. Communities that were themselves on the edge of starvation could not always afford to support members who could not contribute to their own survival. These decisions were not made callously, but out of desperate necessity, and they probably haunted the survivors long after the immediate crisis had passed. The tools and weapons available to Stone Age humans during winter were marvels of ingenuity born from desperate necessity. Every tool had to be multifunctional, durable, and repairable, using only materials that could be found or salvaged in winter conditions. A broken spear point or a damaged knife could mean the difference between eating and starving, between successful defense and death by predation. Tool maintenance during winter was a constant concern that required both skill and resources. Stone tools could be resharpened, but only if suitable stone was available and only if the user possessed the knowledge and skill to work stone effectively. Wooden handles could be repaired or replaced, but only if appropriate wood could be found and processed. Metal was still thousands of years in the future, so there were no easy fixes or durable materials to fall back on. The creation of new tools during winter was particularly challenging because it required resources that were increasingly scarce. Good stone for toolmaking was not available everywhere, and winter weather made quarrying and transport difficult or impossible. Wood for handles had to be found, harvested, seasoned, and shaped, all while dealing with the complications of cold weather and limited daylight. But perhaps most critically, toolmaking required time and energy that had to be balanced against other survival needs. Time spent crafting tools was time not spent hunting, gathering, or maintaining fires. Energy invested in tool production was energy not available for other survival activities. Stone Age humans had to constantly balance immediate survival needs against investments in equipment that might improve their long-term survival prospects. The weapons used for hunting and defense during Stone Age winters were products of this same brutal calculus of survival efficiency. Spears had to be light enough to be thrown accurately, but heavy enough to penetrate thick hides and deliver fatal wounds. Arrows had to fly straight and hit hard while being constructed from materials that were readily available and easily replaced. The psychology of using these weapons for survival adds another layer of complexity to Stone Age winter survival. Modern humans, even those who hunt recreationally, are generally removed from the reality of killing for survival. For Stone Age humans, the ability to kill efficiently and without hesitation was literally a matter of life and death. They had to overcome natural human reluctance to take life, not for sport or trophy, but for the basic necessities of continued existence. This necessity created a mindset that modern humans find difficult to understand. Stone Age hunters had to be simultaneously compassionate enough to maintain community bonds and ruthless enough to kill whatever was necessary for survival. They had to balance respect for the animals they hunted with the practical reality that sentimentality could lead to starvation. The hunting strategies employed during winter were desperate gambles that required incredible skill, patience, and courage. Tracking animals through snow and harsh weather required the ability to read subtle signs and interpret animal behavior under conditions that obscured normal indicators. Following tracks in snow might lead to food, or it might lead hunters away from safety and into deadly encounters with predators or severe weather. The risk-reward calculations involved in winter hunting were starkly different from those in other seasons. A successful hunt could provide enough food to sustain a group for weeks, But an unsuccessful hunt wasted precious energy and exposed hunters to deadly risks. Hunters had to evaluate their chances of success against the certainty that failure could doom not just themselves, but their entire community. Group hunting strategies required levels of coordination and trust that most modern humans never experience. Hunters had to coordinate their movements across difficult terrain, communicate silently to avoid spooking prey, and execute complex maneuvers that required split-second timing and absolute confidence in their companions' abilities and intentions. The weapons training required for effective hunting was a lifelong process that began in childhood and continued throughout an individual's hunting career. Modern recreational archers and hunters, even those who train intensively, rarely achieve the level of proficiency that was routine for Stone Age hunters. The difference was that for Stone Age humans, missing a shot didn't mean going home empty-handed. It meant potentially going home to watch your family starve. But hunting was only one component of the food acquisition strategies that Stone Age humans employed during winter. Fishing, where possible, provided another potential source of protein that was often more predictable than hunting large game. However, winter fishing presented its own unique challenges and dangers that required specialized knowledge and equipment. Ice fishing required the ability to locate fish under ice, create and maintain holes in frozen surfaces, and fish effectively in conditions that would challenge modern recreational fishermen equipped with advanced gear and heated shelters. Stone Age ice fishermen had to accomplish these tasks, using primitive tools while exposed to temperatures that could cause frostbite in minutes. The processing and preservation of fish during winter required techniques that maximized nutritional value while minimizing spoilage risks. Fish had to be cleaned, processed, and preserved quickly, often in conditions that made detailed work difficult or dangerous. The knowledge required to distinguish between fish that were safe to eat and those that were not was critical, as food poisoning during winter could quickly become fatal. Trapping represented another critical component of Stone Age winter survival strategies. Traps allowed hunters to capture prey without expending the energy required for active hunting, and they could operate continuously even when humans were engaged in other survival tasks. However, trap construction and placement required extensive knowledge of animal behavior, terrain features, and seasonal patterns. The materials used for trap construction had to be scavenged from the winter environment or prepared in advance during more abundant seasons. Cordage made from plant fibers or animal sinews, trigger mechanisms carved from wood or bone, and structural elements that could withstand both weather and the struggles of trapped animals. Every component had to be crafted with care, because a failed trap meant not just lost opportunity, but wasted materials that might not be replaceable. Trap maintenance during winter was an ongoing challenge that required regular inspection and repair. Weather could damage trap components. Animals could steal, bait, or trigger traps without being caught, and successful traps had to be reset quickly to continue producing food. Trappers had to balance the energy invested in trap maintenance against the potential returns, constantly evaluating whether their time and effort were better spent on trapping or other survival activities. The psychological aspects of depending on traps for survival added another layer of stress to Stone Age winter existence. Unlike active hunting, which gave hunters some sense of control over outcomes, trapping was largely a matter of hope and probability. Trappers had to check their traps regularly, while managing their expectations and preparing for the disappointment of empty traps during critical periods. The knowledge systems required for effective trapping were encyclopedic and had to be maintained without written records. Trappers had to understand the behavior patterns of dozens of different prey species, the seasonal variations in those patterns, the effects of weather, and other environmental factors on animal behavior, and the specific techniques that were most effective for each species and situation. But even the most skilled trappers faced periods when their efforts produced little or no food. During these times, Stone Age humans had to fall back on survival strategies that would challenge even the most hardcore modern survival enthusiasts. They learned to exploit every possible food source, no matter how marginal or unappetizing it might seem to modern sensibilities. Emergency food sources included things that most modern humans would never consider eating: tree bark, certain roots that required extensive processing to become digestible, insects and larvae that could be found even in winter conditions, and the contents of animal stomachs that might contain partially digested plant matter that could provide essential nutrients. The preparation of these emergency foods often required techniques that were time-consuming, energy-intensive, and not always successful. Tree bark, for example, had to be harvested from the right species of trees, processed to remove inedible outer layers, and prepared in ways that made it digestible and nutritious. The knowledge of which trees were suitable, how to process them safely, and how to prepare them palatably was critical information that had to be preserved and transmitted across generations. The psychological challenge of eating foods that would normally be considered inedible cannot be underestimated. Humans have strong psychological responses to novel foods, particularly those that violate normal categories of what is considered edible. Stone Age humans had to overcome these natural aversions in order to survive, training themselves to eat whatever was available, regardless of taste, texture, or psychological appeal. The social dynamics of sharing emergency foods presented additional challenges. When resources were extremely limited and consisted of foods that were barely palatable under the best circumstances, communities had to maintain fair distribution systems while dealing with the natural human tendency to hoard resources during times of scarcity. Water procurement during Stone Age winters was another constant challenge that required both planning and daily effort. Modern humans turn a handle and expect clean, potable water to flow freely. Stone Age humans had to locate, procure, and often process water sources while dealing with freezing temperatures, contamination risks, and the energy costs of heating water for consumption. Natural water sources during winter were often frozen, contaminated, or difficult to access. Rivers and streams might be partially frozen, creating dangerous conditions for water collection. Ponds and lakes might be completely frozen, requiring the ability to break through ice thick enough to support human weight. Snow and ice could provide water, but melting them required fuel and energy that had to be balanced against other survival needs. The purification of water sources was critical because waterborne diseases could quickly become fatal without modern medical treatment. Stone Age humans had to develop techniques for purifying water using only natural materials and primitive heating methods. Boiling was effective, but required fuel and containers that could withstand repeated heating. Filtration through natural materials could remove some contaminants, but was not foolproof. Water storage during winter presented additional challenges, because containers had to protect water from freezing while remaining portable and durable. Frozen water was useless for immediate consumption and could damage containers, but preventing freezing required constant attention and energy expenditure that competed with other survival needs. The daily water requirements for human survival remained constant regardless of season, but winter conditions made meeting those requirements exponentially more difficult. Dehydration during winter was particularly dangerous, because it impaired the body's ability to regulate temperature and maintain circulation to extremities, increasing the risk of frostbite and other cold-related injuries. Medical care during Stone Age winters was primitive by modern standards, but represented the accumulated knowledge of generations of healers who had learned to treat injuries and illnesses using only natural materials and traditional techniques. The effectiveness of some of these treatments was remarkable, while others were probably useless or even harmful. But they represented the best available options for people who had no alternatives. The diagnostic capabilities of Stone Age healers were based on careful observation of symptoms and patient behavior, combined with accumulated experience treating similar conditions. Without modern diagnostic tools, healers had to rely on their senses and intuition to determine what was wrong with patients and what treatments might be effective. The pharmacological knowledge possessed by Stone Age healers was extensive and often remarkably sophisticated. They understood the medicinal properties of numerous plants, knew how to prepare and administer them safely, and had developed dosing protocols that balanced effectiveness against toxicity risks. Some of these traditional remedies have been validated by modern pharmaceutical research, while others remain mysteries that modern science has not yet fully understood. Surgical procedures performed by Stone Age healers were necessarily crude, but often effective within their limitations. They could set broken bones, suture wounds using natural materials, remove infected tissue, and even perform some forms of brain surgery that have been documented in archaeological evidence. The survival rates for these procedures were probably much lower than modern surgical outcomes, but they represented genuine attempts to treat conditions that would otherwise be fatal. The pain management techniques available to Stone Age healers were limited, but included both pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical approaches. Certain plants possessed analgesic properties that could provide some relief from pain, while psychological and social techniques helped patients cope with discomfort and trauma. The healing rituals and ceremonies that accompanied medical treatment probably provided genuine psychological benefits that supported physical healing processes. The training of healers was a long process that required not only the acquisition of specific technical knowledge, but also the development of diagnostic skills, patient management abilities, and the psychological resilience necessary to deal with suffering and death on a regular basis. Healers had to maintain their effectiveness while dealing with the same survival pressures as other community members, providing care for others while struggling to meet their own basic needs. The loss of skilled healers represented catastrophic events for Stone Age communities because their knowledge was not easily replaced, and their services became more critical during the stressful conditions of winter survival. Communities probably developed systems for training multiple healers and preserving medical knowledge across generations. But the death of an experienced healer during winter could doom other community members who depended on their expertise. The spiritual and psychological support provided by healers was probably as important as their medical interventions. In communities where death was a constant threat and medical options were severely limited, healers served as sources of hope, comfort, and meaning during the darkest periods of winter survival. As we delve deeper into the specific realities of Stone Age winter survival, it becomes increasingly clear that the question of whether modern humans could survive such conditions is not just about physical capabilities or technical knowledge. It's about fundamental differences in psychology, social organization, and relationship with the natural world that separate us from our ancestors by more than just technology and time. Our ancestors lived in a world where death was always present, where comfort was temporary and precious, where every day required active effort to secure the basic necessities of existence. They developed mental toughness and emotional resilience that modern humans rarely need to cultivate because our survival needs are generally met by systems and institutions that we don't have to think about. The social bonds that held Stone Age communities together were forged in the crucible of shared survival challenges that most modern humans never experience. when your life literally depends on the cooperation and competence of your community members. Relationships take on a depth and importance that social media connections and professional networks can never match. The knowledge systems that preserved survival information across generations were maintained through oral traditions, practical demonstrations, and cultural practices that embedded critical information in stories, songs, and rituals that could be remembered and transmitted without written records. Modern humans, dependent on external information storage systems, have largely lost the mental disciplines required to maintain such comprehensive knowledge systems in human memory. The risk assessment and decision-making processes that Stone Age humans developed were calibrated to life and death consequences in ways that modern decision-making rarely requires. Every choice had to be evaluated not just for its immediate benefits, but for its potential to enhance or threaten survival prospects. This created a mental framework that was simultaneously more cautious and more decisive than modern approaches to problem solving. The relationship with the natural world that Stone Age humans maintained was fundamentally different from modern human relationships with nature. They were not separate from or superior to the natural world, but embedded within it as participants in complex ecological relationships that they had to understand and respect in order to survive. Would you survive a Stone Age winter? The honest answer remains overwhelmingly negative for most modern humans. But the more important insight might be recognizing what we have gained and what we have lost in the transition from Stone Age survival to modern civilization. We have gained comfort, security, and possibilities that our ancestors could never have imagined, but we have also lost capabilities, knowledge, and psychological resilience that allowed them to thrive under conditions that would destroy us. Perhaps the most valuable lesson from studying Stone Age winter survival is not learning specific survival techniques, though those have their place, but rather developing appreciation for human adaptability, respect for the knowledge and capabilities of our ancestors, and perspective on our own lives and challenges. The next time you find yourself complaining about minor inconveniences, remember that you are the descendant of people who considered it a good day if nobody died of exposure, starvation, or predation. The next time you face a challenging decision, remember that your ancestors made life and death choices daily with far less information and far more serious consequences. The next time you feel overwhelmed by modern life, remember that human beings are capable of extraordinary resilience and adaptability when circumstances demand it. But let's explore even more deeply the specific nightmares that awaited anyone unlucky enough to face a Stone Age winter. We've covered the basics, but there are layers upon layers of horror and hardship that we haven't even touched upon. Each one a potential death sentence for the unprepared and unlucky. Consider the clothing maintenance requirements that could mean the difference between warmth and death. Your Stone Age winter wardrobe wasn't just about fashion choices. It was a complex life support system that required constant attention and expert care. Animal hide clothing had to be cleaned, dried, and maintained regularly to preserve its insulating properties and prevent deterioration. But cleaning leather in winter conditions was a nightmare of competing priorities. Water was scarce and precious, needed for drinking and cooking. Using it for cleaning clothes was a luxury that communities could rarely afford. But dirty, greasy leather lost its insulating properties and became breeding grounds for parasites and bacteria that could cause skin infections and diseases. Your ancestors had to balance the immediate need for warmth against the long-term risks of poor hygiene, making decisions that could have life or death consequences weeks or months down the road. The repair of winter clothing was equally critical and challenging. A tear in a fur garment could create a pathway for cold air that would quickly lead to hypothermia. But repairing leather required tools, materials, and skills that were not always available. Needles had to be carved from bone or sharp stone. Thread had to be made from animal sinews or plant fibers. The repair work had to be done in poor light and cold conditions that made detailed work nearly impossible. Even more terrifying was the reality of clothing failure during extreme weather events. A blizzard or ice storm could damage clothing beyond immediate repair, leaving individuals exposed to deadly conditions with no backup options. Modern humans have spare clothes, indoor heating, and the option of purchasing replacements. Stone Age humans facing clothing failure during winter faced the very real possibility of freezing to death before they could craft replacements. The psychological pressure of depending entirely on your clothing for survival created a mindset that modern humans can barely comprehend. Every garment was precious beyond measure. Every repair was critical. Every decision about clothing use had to factor in long-term durability against immediate needs. The stress of this responsibility, combined with the constant awareness that clothing failure could mean death, would be overwhelming for people accustomed to treating clothes as disposable consumer goods. Footwear deserves special attention because foot injuries during winter were often death sentences. Frostbite in the feet could lead to gangrene, amputation, and death from infection. But protecting feet required footwear that was simultaneously waterproof, insulating, durable, and flexible enough to allow normal walking and running. Creating such footwear using only animal hides and primitive tools was an incredible challenge that required expertise most modern cobblers couldn't match. The maintenance of winter footwear was a daily concern that could not be neglected without serious consequences. Wet footwear had to be dried carefully to prevent cracking and damage. Worn areas had to be reinforced before they became holes that would allow cold and moisture to enter. The materials used for insulation, often dried grass or animal fur, had to be replaced regularly as they became compressed and lost their insulating properties. But perhaps, most critically, Stone-aged humans had to create and maintain multiple sets of footwear because backup options were essential for survival. A hunter whose boots failed during a hunting expedition could face frostbite and death before returning to shelter. Communities had to invest significant time and resources in creating reserve footwear, even when those resources were desperately needed for other survival needs. The creation of winter footwear required knowledge of animal anatomy, leatherworking techniques, and design principles that took years to master. The best Stone Age footwear was probably as effective as modern boots, but creating it required skills that have largely been lost in the modern world. Most modern humans couldn't create functional footwear from raw animal hides even with access to modern tools, much less using Stone Age implements. Now let's examine the horrifying realities of food poisoning during Stone Age winters. Modern humans who get food poisoning can visit hospitals, receive 4 fluids and medications, and recover in climate-controlled environments with medical supervision. Stone Age humans who developed food poisoning during winter faced potential death from dehydration, fever, and weakness at exactly the time when physical capability was most critical for survival. The preservation techniques available to Stone Age humans were effective, but not foolproof. Smoked meat could develop mold or bacterial contamination that was not immediately visible. Dried foods could become contaminated with insects or rodent droppings that carried diseases. Stored plant foods could develop fungal infections that produced deadly toxins. The knowledge required to identify safe foods versus contaminated foods was literally a matter of life and death. The pressure to consume questionable foods during periods of starvation created impossible choices between immediate hunger and potential food poisoning. Communities facing starvation had to decide whether to eat foods that might be contaminated, knowing that food poisoning could be fatal, but that starvation was certainly fatal. These decisions probably haunted survivors long after the immediate crisis had passed. The symptoms of food poisoning. particularly severe diarrhea and vomiting, had catastrophic effects on individuals who were already struggling with malnutrition and dehydration. The rapid loss of fluids and electrolytes could quickly lead to death, especially when replacement fluids were not readily available. The weakness and incapacitation caused by food poisoning could also prevent individuals from performing survival tasks, creating a downward spiral that often led to death. The social impact of food poisoning during winter survival was equally devastating. Sick individuals required care and resources while being unable to contribute to group survival efforts. If multiple people became ill simultaneously, entire communities could be destroyed as the remaining healthy members became overwhelmed, trying to care for the sick while maintaining the basic survival tasks that kept everyone alive. The treatment of food poisoning using only Stone Age medical knowledge was primitive and often ineffective. Healers might attempt to induce vomiting to remove contaminated foods, provide herbal remedies that were thought to help with digestive problems, or simply try to keep patients warm and hydrated using whatever resources were available. The success rate of these treatments was probably quite low, and many people who might survive food poisoning in modern hospitals would have died during Stone Age winters. The prevention of food poisoning required constant vigilance and expert knowledge that had to be applied under difficult conditions. Foods had to be inspected regularly for signs of spoilage. Storage areas had to be protected from contamination, and preparation techniques had to be followed precisely to minimize risks. The margin for error was essentially zero, because a single mistake could kill not just the person who made it, but potentially their entire family or community. Let's also consider the nightmare scenario of shelter failure during extreme weather events. Modern buildings are engineered to withstand specific loads and environmental conditions, and when they fail, people can usually evacuate to alternate shelters or receive emergency assistance. Stone Age shelters were much more vulnerable to catastrophic failure, and when they collapsed or became uninhabitable, the occupants faced immediate life-threatening exposure with limited options for alternative shelter. The construction of Stone Age winter shelters required balancing multiple competing requirements that were difficult to optimize simultaneously. Shelters had to be strong enough to withstand wind, snow loads, and potential impacts from falling trees or other debris. They had to provide adequate insulation to retain heat, while allowing sufficient ventilation to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning from fires. They had to be defensible against predators, while remaining accessible for the humans who lived in them. The materials used for shelter construction were often marginal and prone to failure under extreme conditions. Animal hides used for walls and roofing could freeze and become brittle, making them vulnerable to tears and punctures. Wooden structural elements could snap under heavy snow loads or become weakened by moisture and temperature cycling. Stone foundations could shift and destabilize the entire structure. The maintenance of winter shelters was an ongoing challenge that required constant attention and regular repairs. Small problems, if left unaddressed, could quickly become catastrophic failures that left entire communities exposed to deadly conditions. But shelter maintenance required materials, tools, and energy that had to be balanced against other survival needs, creating difficult decisions about resource allocation. The loss of shelter during winter was often a death sentence for Stone Age communities. Unlike modern humans, who can call emergency services or relocate to alternate housing, Stone Age humans whose shelters failed had to either repair them immediately under life-threatening conditions or attempt to construct new shelters using whatever materials they could scavenge in winter conditions. The psychological impact of shelter insecurity was probably profound and constant. Modern humans worry about mortgage payments and property values. Stone Age humans worried about whether their homes would literally collapse and kill them during the night. The stress of living in structures that were always potentially one storm away from catastrophic failure would be overwhelming for people accustomed to the structural reliability of modern buildings. The heating systems used in Stone Age shelters were particularly vulnerable to dangerous failures. Open fires created constant risks of carbon monoxide poisoning, accidental burns, and structural fires that could destroy entire shelters and kill their occupants. The balance between adequate heating and fire safety had to be maintained constantly, with no room for error or complacency. Ventilation management in heated Stone Age shelters was a life-and-death skill that required understanding of airflow dynamics that most modern humans don't possess. Too much ventilation and all the heat escapes, leaving occupants to freeze. Too little ventilation and carbon monoxide builds up, causing unconsciousness and death. The optimal balance had to be maintained continuously, adjusting for changing weather conditions, fire intensity, and shelter occupancy. The fuel management required for winter heating was another constant source of stress and potential disaster. Fuel had to be gathered, processed, and stored in quantities sufficient to last through unpredictably long winters. But fuel storage created fire hazards that could destroy shelters and kill occupants. Green or wet fuel produced dangerous levels of smoke and carbon monoxide. The wrong types of fuel could produce toxic fumes that were deadly in enclosed spaces. Now, let's examine the terrifying realities of injury treatment during Stone Age winters. Modern emergency medicine can treat traumatic injuries that would have been instantly fatal just decades ago. Stone-aged humans, facing serious injuries, had to rely on primitive medical knowledge and hope for outcomes that would be considered miraculous by modern standards. Fractures were particularly dangerous during winter because they prevented individuals from performing the physical activities necessary for survival. A hunter with a broken leg could not hunt. A gatherer with a broken arm could not process foods or maintain fires. The injury itself might be survivable, but the inability to contribute to survival activities could doom both the injured person and their dependents. The treatment of fractures using only Stone Age medical techniques was crude but sometimes surprisingly effective. Healers understood the importance of immobilizing broken bones and had developed splinting techniques using available materials. But setting bones properly required anatomical knowledge and skill that was not always available. Poorly set fractures could heal incorrectly, leaving individuals permanently disabled in ways that would be death sentences during subsequent survival challenges. Infection was the great killer that turned survivable injuries into death sentences. Without antibiotics or sterile surgical techniques, even minor wounds could become infected and lead to sepsis and death. Stone Age healers understood the importance of keeping wounds clean and had developed some effective techniques for wound care, but their success rate was probably quite low by modern standards. The pain management available for injured Stone Age humans was extremely limited. Some plants possessed analgesic properties, and healers had developed techniques for using them effectively. But severe injuries often caused pain that was beyond the capacity of primitive pain relief to manage. Injured individuals had to endure agony that would be considered inhumane by modern medical standards, while still attempting to contribute to their own survival and that of their communities. The social burden of caring for seriously injured community members created difficult decisions about resource allocation during periods of scarcity. An injured person who required constant care was consuming resources while being unable to contribute to survival efforts. Communities had to balance compassion and loyalty against a harsh reality that caring for the injured might doom everyone to death by starvation or exposure. The psychological impact of witnessing serious injuries and primitive medical treatment would be traumatic for people accustomed to modern medical care. Stone Age humans regularly saw levels of pain, suffering, and medical intervention that would cause most modern humans to faint or become psychologically incapacitated. They had to develop emotional resilience that allowed them to function effectively even while watching friends and family members suffer and die from conditions that modern medicine could easily treat. The amputation of severely injured or infected limbs was sometimes necessary to save lives, but Stone Age surgical techniques were brutal by modern standards. Amputations were performed using stone tools without anesthesia, antiseptics, or proper surgical instruments. The survival rates for such procedures was probably quite low, and those who did survive faced the challenge of adapting to permanent disabilities in an environment where physical capability was essential for survival. The rehabilitation of injured individuals was a community responsibility that required significant investment of time and resources. Unlike modern rehabilitation programs with specialized equipment and professional therapists, Stone Age communities had to develop their own techniques for helping injured members regain functionality using only available resources and accumulated knowledge. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the reality that many injuries that are easily treatable today were simply death sentences during Stone Age winters. A broken spine, severe head trauma, internal injuries, or major burns would almost certainly be fatal without modern medical intervention. Stone Age humans lived with the knowledge that accidents which we consider minor inconveniences could quickly become death sentences for themselves or their loved ones. Let's explore another nightmare scenario that modern humans rarely consider: the complete breakdown of group cohesion during survival crises. Our individualistic culture assumes that people can survive independently if necessary. But Stone Age winter survival was absolutely dependent on group cooperation. When communities fractured under the pressure of survival stress, the results were usually catastrophic for everyone involved. The triggers for group breakdown were numerous and often unpredictable. Disputes over resource allocation could escalate into conflicts that destroyed community unity. Leadership challenges during crisis situations could split groups into competing factions. Personal conflicts, exacerbated by stress and confinement, could grow into feuds that made cooperation impossible. Religious or cultural disagreements could divide communities along ideological lines. The process of group breakdown was often rapid and irreversible once it began. Trust, built up over years of successful cooperation, could be destroyed in moments by accusations of hoarding, favoritism, or cowardice. Once community members began viewing each other as competitors rather than collaborators, the cooperative behaviors essential for survival became increasingly difficult to maintain. The violence that sometimes accompanied group breakdown was particularly devastating during winter when communities could not afford to lose any members to conflict. Fights over resources could result in injuries or deaths that weakened the group's overall survival capabilities. The psychological trauma of violence within the community could further damage group cohesion and make future cooperation even more difficult. The formation of competing subgroups within larger communities was often a prelude to complete breakdown. When individuals began forming alliances against other community members, the trust and cooperation necessary for survival were replaced by suspicion and competition. These internal divisions often proved more deadly than external threats, because they destroyed the community's ability to respond effectively to survival challenges. The exile or abandonment of community members was sometimes used as a way to resolve conflicts or eliminate individuals who were perceived as burdens or threats. But exile during winter was essentially a death sentence, and communities that resorted to such measures were often signing death warrants for people who might have contributed to survival if conflicts had been resolved differently. The impact of group breakdown on children was particularly tragic because they were completely dependent on adult cooperation for survival. When communities fractured, Children often became pawns in adult conflicts or were abandoned when their care became burdensome during resource-scarce periods. The survival rate for children during community breakdowns was probably close to zero. The psychological aftermath of group breakdown haunted survivors long after immediate crises had passed. Individuals who had betrayed former friends or abandoned community members to die carried guilt and trauma that affected their ability to form trusting relationships in future survival situations. The knowledge that cooperation could break down so completely made it difficult to invest fully in new community relationships. But let's also examine the specific horrors of childbirth during Stone Age winters, an event that combined all the dangers of primitive medicine with the additional challenges of winter survival. Modern obstetric care has made childbirth relatively safe, but Stone Age women faced mortality rates that would be shocking by contemporary standards. The timing of childbirth during winter created impossible situations for Stone Age communities. Pregnancy and childbirth consumed enormous resources at exactly the time when resources were most scarce. Pregnant women required additional food and protection, but were often less able to contribute to survival activities. The energy demands of pregnancy and breastfeeding increased caloric needs just when calories were most difficult to obtain. The medical complications that could arise during Stone Age childbirth were often fatal for both mother and child. Without modern surgical techniques, complications like breached presentations, umbilical cord problems, or placental difficulties were usually death sentences. The infection risks associated with childbirth were enormous when sterile conditions were impossible to maintain and antibiotics were unknown. The pain management available for Stone Age childbirth was extremely limited. Some plants possessed properties that could ease labor pains, but the effectiveness of these remedies was questionable, and their availability during winter was uncertain. Women had to endure levels of pain that modern pain management techniques would never allow, while still attempting to participate in survival activities before and after delivery. The care of newborn infants during Stone Age winters presented challenges that would overwhelm modern parents, even with all available resources. Newborns required constant warmth in conditions where maintaining adequate heat was a constant struggle. They needed frequent feeding when food resources were severely limited. They required protection from diseases when sanitary conditions were primitive and medical care was almost non-existent. The mortality rate for Stone Age infants during winter was probably catastrophically high. Infants who survived the birth process still faced threats from exposure, malnutrition, disease, and predation that killed large percentages before they reached their first birthday. The emotional toll on parents who lost multiple children to conditions that modern medicine could easily prevent must have been enormous. The social impact of childbirth during winter survival situations created difficult decisions about resource allocation. A community struggling to keep existing members alive had to decide how much of their limited resources to invest in pregnant women and newborn infants who had uncertain survival prospects. These decisions were not made callously, but out of desperate necessity when everyone's survival was at stake. The contraception and family planning knowledge available to Stone Age humans was limited, but probably included some effective techniques for preventing pregnancy during inappropriate times. However, the effectiveness of these methods was uncertain, and unplanned pregnancies during winter survival situations created crises that could threaten entire communities. Now, let's consider the psychological horrors of prolonged darkness during Stone Age winters. Modern humans who experience seasonal depression from reduced daylight have access to light therapy, antidepressant medications, and the knowledge that their condition is temporary and treatable. Stone Age humans faced months of limited daylight, with no understanding of seasonal affective disorder and no effective treatments. The reduction in daylight during winter had profound effects on human psychology and physiology. Vitamin D deficiency, caused by lack of sun exposure, led to weakened bones, compromised immune function, and increased susceptibility to disease. The disruption of circadian rhythms affected sleep patterns, mood regulation, and cognitive function at exactly the time when mental clarity was most critical for survival decisions. The depression and anxiety caused by prolonged darkness would have been devastating for individuals who needed to remain alert, motivated, and capable of making life and death decisions. The hopelessness that accompanies severe seasonal depression could have led to dangerous risk-taking, neglect of survival tasks, or complete psychological breakdown that endangered entire communities. The social dynamics within communities confined to small spaces during long, dark winters were incredibly challenging. Modern humans struggle with cabin fever after a few days of bad weather. Stone Age communities had to maintain group harmony and cooperation through months of confinement in cramped, poorly ventilated spaces with limited privacy and constant stress. The conflict resolution skills required for managing interpersonal disputes during prolonged confinement were critical for community survival. Small disagreements that would be easily resolved in normal circumstances could escalate into major conflicts when people were stressed, hungry, and unable to escape from each other's company. Leaders had to develop sophisticated techniques for managing personalities and mediating disputes before they destroyed group cohesion. The entertainment and cultural activities that helped communities cope with psychological stress during winter confinement were not luxuries but essential components of mental health maintenance. Storytelling, music, games, and artistic activities provided psychological relief and helped maintain social bonds. During periods when cooperation was most critical and most difficult to maintain, the religious and spiritual practices that provided meaning and hope during the darkest periods of winter were probably essential for maintaining the psychological resilience necessary for survival. The rituals and ceremonies that marked the passage of time and provided hope for eventual spring helped communities endure conditions that would otherwise be psychologically unbearable. But let's examine another terrifying aspect of Stone Age winter survival: the complete absence of privacy that modern humans take for granted. In our contemporary world, we can retreat to private spaces when we need to decompress, process emotions, or simply escape from social interaction. Stone Age humans had no such luxury during winter survival situations. The intimate proximity required for sharing body heat and conserving fuel meant that Stone Age communities lived in conditions of enforced intimacy that would be psychologically crushing for modern individuals. Every personal moment, every emotional reaction, every bodily function was potentially visible to other community members. The psychological pressure of constant observation and judgment would be overwhelming for people accustomed to privacy and personal space. The sexual dynamics within confined Stone Age communities during winter survival were probably complex and sometimes problematic. The stress of survival could either increase or decrease sexual activity, and the lack of privacy made intimate relationships difficult to maintain. The potential for sexual conflicts or inappropriate behavior was enormous when people were confined together, under extreme stress with no possibility of escape. The management of waste products in confined winter shelters was a constant challenge that affected both health and social dynamics. Human waste had to be disposed of safely without contaminating living spaces or water sources, but winter conditions made proper sanitation extremely difficult. The accumulation of waste products in living areas could quickly lead to disease outbreaks that killed entire communities. The odors associated with poor sanitation, unwashed bodies, cooking foods, and animal products would have been overwhelming by modern standards. Stone Age humans had to develop tolerance for levels of smell that would cause most contemporary people to become nauseated or incapacitated. The psychological impact of living in such conditions for months would be difficult for modern humans to endure. Let's also explore the terrifying realities of predator encounters during Stone Age winters. Modern humans who encounter large predators can usually escape to vehicles, buildings, or other secure locations, and they can call for emergency assistance if attacked. Stone-aged humans facing predator encounters had only primitive weapons and their own physical capabilities to protect themselves and their communities. The behavior of predators during winter was often more dangerous than during other seasons, because hungry animals became bolder and more desperate as prey became scarce. Wolves, bears, large cats, and other carnivores were more likely to approach human settlements, and more likely to view humans as potential food sources when their normal prey was difficult to find. The tracking and hunting skills that made Stone Age humans effective hunters also made them better able to avoid predator encounters. But this knowledge was not always sufficient protection against determined predators. A pack of hungry wolves or a desperate bear could overcome even experienced hunters who were weakened by malnutrition and cold. The weapons available for defending against predators were the same primitive tools used for hunting, and they were often inadequate for stopping large, aggressive animals. Spears and arrows that could kill prey animals over time might not stop a charging predator quickly enough to prevent human casualties. The close-quarters combat that sometimes resulted from predator encounters was usually fatal for the humans involved. The psychological impact of living under constant threat from predators created a level of stress and vigilance that modern humans rarely experience. Every sound in the night could signal approaching danger. Every venture outside the safety of shelter carried the risk of fatal encounters. The constant alertness required for avoiding predation was exhausting and psychologically draining. The group defense strategies required for protecting communities from predator attacks demanded levels of coordination and courage that most modern humans would find impossible to maintain. Community members had to be willing to risk their own lives to protect others, and they had to trust that others would do the same for them. The failure of group defense strategies usually resulted in catastrophic casualties that could destroy entire communities. As we near the end of our journey through the nightmarish realities of Stone Age winter survival, it becomes clear that the question, "Would you survive a Stone Age winter?" has an answer that should humble every modern human. Absolutely not. Not only would we fail to survive, but we would probably die in ways that would be embarrassingly quick and utterly preventable by Stone Age standards. Our physical conditioning is inadequate for the demands of constant survival activity. Our knowledge base lacks the practical skills necessary for meeting basic survival needs. Our psychological preparation is insufficient for handling the stress, fear, and hardship that define Stone Age existence. Our social skills are poorly adapted to the kind of intimate cooperation that was essential for group survival. But perhaps most fundamentally, our entire worldview and relationship with the natural environment is incompatible with Stone Age survival requirements. We think of ourselves as separate from and superior to nature, while Stone Age humans understood themselves to be participants in natural systems that they had to understand and respect in order to survive. The technology that has insulated us from survival challenges has also disconnected us from the knowledge and capabilities that our ancestors developed over thousands of generations. We have gained incredible powers and capabilities, but we have also lost touch with the fundamental realities of human existence that shaped our species for most of its history. The study of Stone Age winter survival is not just an academic exercise in historical curiosity. It is a reminder of what humans are capable of when necessity demands it, a testament to the ingenuity and resilience that allowed our species to survive and thrive under conditions that seem impossible from our current perspective. It is also a sobering reminder of how dependent we have become on systems and technologies that we don't fully understand and can't control. The collapse of modern infrastructure, whether from natural disasters, economic crises, or other catastrophes, could potentially force modern humans to confront survival challenges that we are utterly unprepared to meet. But perhaps most importantly, the study of Stone Age survival can give us perspective on our current lives and problems. The challenges that seem overwhelming in modern life pale in comparison to the daily life and death struggles that our ancestors considered routine. The stress we experience from traffic jams, work deadlines, and social media drama would seem laughably trivial to people who spent their lives calculating whether they had enough food to survive until spring. This perspective is not meant to minimize the real challenges and difficulties of modern life, but rather to provide context for human resilience and adaptability. If our ancestors could survive Stone Age winters with nothing but primitive tools and unconquerable determination, perhaps we can find the strength to handle whatever challenges our modern world presents. The next time you flip a switch and lights come on, remember that your ancestors spent winter evenings in darkness, huddled around fires that had to be maintained constantly to prevent death by exposure. The next time you open a refrigerator full of food, remember that your ancestors had to hunt, gather, and preserve every calorie they consumed while facing the constant possibility of starvation. The next time you adjust a thermostat to maintain comfortable temperatures, remember that your ancestors had to balance heating needs against fuel availability, fire safety, and carbon monoxide risks in a constant struggle to maintain just enough warmth to survive. The next time you visit a doctor for routine medical care, remember that your ancestors had to treat injuries and illnesses using only primitive knowledge and available materials, with no backup options if treatment failed. You are the descendant of the most successful survivors in the history of life on Earth. Every one of your ancestors, stretching back through thousands of generations, managed to survive long enough to reproduce and pass their genetic and cultural legacy on to the next generation. That legacy includes not just DNA, but also the accumulated knowledge, skills, and cultural practices that made survival possible under conditions that would defeat most modern humans. The strength, ingenuity, and determination that allowed your ancestors to survive Stone Age winters are still part of your heritage, even if you've never had occasion to use them. The capacity for cooperation, innovation, and persistence that turned impossible survival situations into the foundation for human civilization is still available to you when circumstances demand it. Would you survive a Stone Age winter? Probably not. At least not without extensive preparation and training that most of us will never receive. But the more important question is whether you can learn to approach your modern challenges with the same courage, creativity, and community spirit that allowed your ancestors to turn the harshest season of the year into an opportunity for human triumph. The winter winds that once threatened to extinguish human existence now serve as reminders of how far we have come and how capable we can be when necessity demands it. Our ancestors faced the darkness and cold with nothing but stone tools and unbreakable spirits. They not only survived, but created the foundation for a world where their descendants could contemplate their struggles from positions of unprecedented comfort and security. That is perhaps the greatest testament to their success. Not that they survived, but that they survived so completely and effectively that we can now wonder whether we could match their achievements. The very fact that you can ask this question while surrounded by warmth, food, and safety is proof of their incredible victory over forces that seemed insurmountable. So honor their memory, not just by learning about their struggles, but by approaching your own challenges with the same unshakable determination that allowed them to turn Stone Age winters from seasons of death into seasons of human triumph. Remember that you carry their legacy in your genes, your culture, and your capacity for resilience in the face of whatever hardships life might present. And the next time winter arrives, with its short days and cold winds, remember that you are experiencing the same seasonal change that once meant months of life and death struggle for your ancestors. Remember that they faced those challenges with courage and creativity and community spirit. Remember that they didn't just survive. They thrived well enough to create the world you now inhabit. You are their gift to the future, the living proof that even the most impossible challenges can be overcome with enough determination, ingenuity, and hope. That may be the most important lesson of all from the study of Stone Age winter survival. Not how to make fire without matches or hunt mammoth with stone spears, but how to face whatever challenges life presents with the unbreakable human spirit that has carried our species through every crisis and catastrophe for hundreds of thousands of years.